It could be me. All right. Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant Young Puck Dotting saw my chess, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So I do have the Hikaru Nakamura versus Wesley So taking out a round 9 from the champion Showdown. There is still a little bit left for me to cover from the tournament. So, you guys have seen like a million, Nakamura versus Wesley So games. They played each other so many times, which is good because there are a lot of pictures online of them. Yes. Sweet. Like this one here that I put. But yes, for all of my people that are in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan. Magandang umaga, magandang apon. It is morning time, but by the time I think a lot of people see this, it'll be lunchtime. So I'm Sao Tayo, Mac Lunch na Tayo. Messiah a king. What am I forgetting? Messiah Akama Kita King Muli. I drew a blank for a second. I'm like, what is that? How do you say that? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Aking mga kaibigan. Thank you guys very much. Yes, so if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. Oh, just a disclaimer. Okay, I know a lot of you guys have been following it, but this is a Chess 960 game. So in case you're confused why the pieces are weird, that's why. Okay, so G3, G6, we got C3, C6, D4, D5. So we have kind of like a King's Indian, a Slav. Ronaldo, man, it's a Slav, dog. Look at it. Oh, man, anyway, it's an inside joke. You had to be there, man. Knight to D3. We got knight to D6. So we have pretty much the identical game going on. So this is kind of like a symmetrical variation of it. We got bishop to F4. And then Wesley So asked Hikaru Nakamura, why did you put your bishop on F4 with G5? Move it. So, I mean, Nakamura just says, never mind then. I'll just put it back on C1. Like, since you insist, Wesley. Bishop comes to H3, which is a really interesting move. It doesn't, like, cause, like, a crazy attack because you're going to, like, trade a bishop for a knight, but it gets the bishop develops nonetheless. We have G4, trying to trap the bishop, but we have H5. That frees the bishop up. We see pawn takes H5, bishop takes F1, rook takes F1, and then queen takes H5. And then we do have rook to G1. And so, I mean, both players have played, like, pretty solidly up to this point. We have brought this rook and this bishop attacking this pawn. Of course, you can always play F6. I mean, F6 will just negate everything that's going on. But we see knight down to E6. We got F3. And then we see bishop to C7. And we have actually reached a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see what move like white really kind of has to play in this position. It's not the only move at all, but it is a very necessary move to play. Go ahead and pause the video and try to guess that move. Okay, so some of you guys might notice that, this pawn is only really kind of protected by the queen. It's kind of like a little interesting because we don't have a knight right here. So it's kind of like an interesting piece at the moment. And I mean, at some point the rook can swing over. So if you don't play fast enough, black will get castled and then they will swing this rook over. And then this other rook can come over after you do something like that. And this can be a very big issue. So time is of the essence. So we see H4 played here. And, of course, white cannot capture here because you're going to be capturing the queen. And then you're going to be taking here and then taking here. And then this rook is going to swing over. Well, the knight would cover. But you see what I mean. I mean, you're going to be dropping an entire piece. So it's not good. But if we actually back up. After we had knight to E6 and we had F3. Black had the opportunity to go F6 here, just really shutting down, like, some stuff that, white would want to try to do, possibly like, moving the knight up here, especially trying to get it out of the way of this bishop, because F5 is actually a pretty nice square. Well, of course, not right now because this knight, but F5 at some point is a potentially, like, good square to go to. And the queen will probably come to G2, rook over to H8, and then rook back to H1. You're creating some problems for black that they don't really have in the variations that we see. Because like I said, after bishop came to C7, we saw H4, and then now rook came over to H8. And black is actually a little bit further ahead development-wise. I mean, they have their pieces out. They're one move away from getting castled. And you see white kind of has like some issues with their development a little bit. So knight comes to c5. We see queen takes h4. We throw in knight takes e6 with check first. Pawn takes e6. You see queen up to g2. You have king down. You got bishop up to d3. So, I mean, white is starting to kind of get their pieces unraveled. You don't necessarily want to do something like that because the rook is going to go ahead and pin. And, you know, you can push the pawn here, but, I mean, the knight is going to possibly come in, cause some problems. So we see rook a to g8, just making sure that we defend that pawn. Bishop comes to d2. We see queen down to h2, forcing a trade. Well, not forcing a trade, but very severely encouraging a trade. King comes up to c2. So as you can see, both sides, I mean, neither one of them castled. They just kind of, you know, tucked their kings into like a little safety pocket, if you will. Queen took g2. We saw rook took g2. Knight back to f7. And we're really going to heavily target this pawn. Since we did have the doubling of these pawns, we don't have any neighboring pawns over here to like help protect the pawn. And so that's the problem. When you do have isolated pawns, you know, usually you have to bring your pieces to help protect that isolated pawn. So that's why it's usually a good idea to try to maintain your pawn structure so that your pawns can support the other pawns. It's not always possible, unfortunately. So rook a comes to g1, and you see g5 is going to drop off the board at some point. We see e5, pawn takes e5, and knight takes e5, and then we now see rook takes g5. So white has gotten their pawn back. We see rook taking g5, rook taking g5, knight taking d3, king taking d3. And I mean, things are fairly equal. I mean, you have the same bishop. You have, you know, just a rook each. And so we actually see rook to h1 in this position. And if we back up, or I mean, go in this position, if some of you guys might be wondering, like, you know, why don't we put the rook on the 7? Like, you know, is it like a blunder, or I mean, is it a good move? Well, the thing about it is, like, rook to h2 is actually just pretty much exactly the same as rook to h1. They both allow penetration. You know, you're just kind of coming in behind these pawns. So it has its merits, but if you did decide, hey, I want to go ahead and go rook to h2, that was a very legitimate move as well. They're pretty interchangeable moves. But I mean, of course, you know, you guys playing rook to h2, you know, there are some definite themes, you know, some definite, you know, fundamentals behind playing the rook to h2. So you would not have been wrong. So, but like I said, going forward to what we had, Wesley so did go rook to h1. We see rook down to g4. We see b5. We got a4, a6, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, and we do see b3. And I mean, pretty much up to this point, both sides have played pretty identical to each other. You know, for the past, let's say like 8 or 9 moves, they pretty much been spitting out all the #1 moves. So I mean, they're neck and neck. We see rook over to b1, and then the king just conveniently goes to c2 and prevents the rook from capturing this pawn and being comfortable on b1. Rook comes to a1. We see c4. Pawn takes c4. Pawn takes c4, and then we have rook to a2. King goes down to c1. We see rook to a1. King comes up to c2. We see rook to a2. King comes down to c1. A rook comes down to a1. And then we do have a draw by 3-fold repetition. Now, if we back up before we have the repetition, there are other moves in this position. I mean, you know, there's bishop to d6. There is bishop to e5. I mean, there's pretty much like all kinds of bishop moves here. You know, let me see. That's a possibility as well. So there, I mean, you have like a plethora of options as white. They're all, surprisingly enough, are saying like 000s. So, I mean, it's not like any one of them are really better than any of the other ones, but I mean, I think it's really hard to blunder this position. You know, as long as your rook stays secure, you keep it on a light square, you know, this bishop can get traded off, something. I mean, you know, you're just good to go. But like I said, we did have all of the checks, and we just kept repeating moves back and forth. If this pawn was to take, I mean, we're going to be taking back with this rook here. And, you know, you kind of have these pawns with these pawns. But you really want white to take this pawn here. Because then if you take back with your pawn, you have these connected pawns and they have these connected pawns. So, you know, we're going to pretty much maintain that position right there. So that is that game. It's one of the more like straightforward kind of like, you know, equal positions that we saw in the tournament. A majority of the time when you're playing like the just chess 960, you get into these like insanely crazy positions, and you know, you still can get draws, but I think it might be interesting to see like, you know, the different types of positions that you can get into. But for all my people in the Philippines, I'll hit you with these good mornings real quick. So maayong buntag, mayad na agahan, naibag na bigat, masantos ya kabason, marhe na aga, buenas dias, maayong aga, mapia na uma, kapian kapuno dios, mayapa abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abluka, my big abukla, marjana buntag, maryam my nat, malpena aga, kasanyangan si ulubi, salam, assalamu alaikum, merci to you. Makito tayo mamaya to my people in the Philippines, pa alam, and I'll see you guys next time.